Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. The pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, from what we can tell from the fragments that we possess of his work, had a very significant interest in what we could call the dynamics of cosmic change. That is, this universe that we're surrounded by and that we move within and we're a part of, what actually is going on when things change from one thing to another? Is there anything, to take some of the other great philosophers of the time, is there anything that can be said to be the same running through all of this? And you're going to notice as you read through his text that he makes reference to several things that we call elements, the basic building blocks of the universe and all the things in it. And the ancient Greeks tended to look at those in terms of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. But they thought that you could take those and build up an entire universe or cosmos of things that were combinations in certain ways of these and dominated by some and perhaps not even including others. And the ancient Greeks are really grappling with this, and it appears that Heraclitus was as well. Now, Heraclitus adopts you could say, if we're on a spectrum from absolute fixity, as in Parmenides, to absolute change, complete flux, nothing stays the same, which is sometimes how Heraclitus is represented by, say, for example, Plato, and by people who later on are satirizing him, like Lucian of Samosata. Heraclitus would actually be not all the way at the end of the spectrum, but a good way towards that end of universal flux. And I think all of you are probably familiar, if you haven't heard it coming from Heraclitus, you've at least heard the expression, you can't step in the same river twice. What's the explanation for that? Because the waters are not the same the moment that you step into the river again. Things are in flux. Things are changing. And the element of water is particularly good for illustrating that because unlike air, you can actually see it. And unlike Earth, which more or less stays the same, at least to the naked eye within our experience, although if we use time-lapse photography, we can see that it moves as well. We can see that water is constantly flowing, and fire is kind of like that as well. So is there then anything that is constant? If there isn't, then we would really have a conceptual problem. How can we have words or concepts or whatever we're going to talk about, representations of a universe that is totally in flux, and largely because of that reason, since there's nothing undergirding it, unpredictable? Well, we couldn't. So the very fact that we have, to use another one of Heraclitus's terms, a logos, whether in the sense of like the cosmic logos that runs everything and structures everything, or logos just in the sense of human language, speeches, which could be deceptive. The very fact that we have that means that it's not a complete flux, it's not a total chaos, there's something more going on. And so this is when we want to look at his discussions. And he talks about, in fragment 30 in the Deals, There is something, cosmos, universe, order, we could say, that is indeed everlasting. And so here's a translation of it. Order was not made by God or human beings. So what is that saying? That means that order is always there. Cosmos, at least, is always there, whatever cosmos means. And it's not dependent on human beings and their constructions of it, although they can certainly represent it all they want to, nor is it dependent on the gods. He says, it is, and it always was, and is, and shall be an everlasting fire, flaring up in regular measures and dying down in regular measures. So that's a decent translation. What Heraclitus is actually saying, and he's using this word "aie" there, which we can translate as always, eternal. It always is. There always is this ordering that's going on. And that ordering itself is, now here's where we have a distinctive, you could say, approach on Heraclitus' part. The elements are not all on the same level. Fire, in some sense, is the most important of the elements. So we have an everlasting fire, a per-aezoon in Greek, right? So per is fire, but this aezoon, right? It's a very interesting construction here. It's not just saying that it's by itself something that is eternal. It, in a certain respect, is eternity. So there's, we can't push this too far, I think, but we can certainly say that there's something interesting going on there. Then the other thing that's really key to this is that this fire, however we want to translate this, it flares up, it expands, it grows, it kindles, and it dies out as well. So it's not by itself something that's purely static, something that has its being in the way that it is once and for all in eternity. Instead, the very thing that is eternal is itself, you could say, expanding and contracting, or becoming more manifest and becoming less manifest. And he says that it does this in measures. Metra in Greek. You can say, well, what's measuring it? Well, we don't actually know. But we do know that it is not random. It's not purely just happening and not happening or anything like that. So that's a really key idea. Another passage that I think is really central in reinforcing this is fragment 38 in the Deals, where he tells us that fire is a medium of exchange. Antamoibe, something that we can give in place of another thing. And it's a medium of exchange for everything. Panta. Maybe even including itself, right? if we think this through. And how is it a medium of exchange? It is a medium of exchange in the same way, he's using an analogy here, that gold is a medium of exchange for all goods, all things that we might want. And again, we could think, well, is gold also a medium of exchange for itself? Is there a measure to this? So fire is what not only, you could say, structures everything and underlies everything, but it's also what everything can be exchanged for in some ways. So this is a good place then to talk about the cosmic processes as Heraclitus represents them. And I think we have to be very careful here not to overread these passages and to read too much of our own ideas into them. We have the passages that we have, and they are quite tantalizing in that they show us that there's at least some sort of rudimentary cosmic process that Heraclitus was interested in theorizing and then representing and teaching us about. But we don't actually know too much about how it works. We can only glimpse portions of it. And presumably his book on nature would have had a lot more of this. The testimonies that are provided by other authors, where they say, well, Heraclitus and his followers taught this, we don't know whether that's actually the case or not. So I just want to stick to what we actually have as fragments. So in one of them, in fragment 31, he tells us that there's this process of, you could say, movement from one thing to another. He calls it the turning points of fire. First, sea. Now it's interesting that he doesn't say water, right? He says sea, thalasha. That's the Greek word for the body of water that they were encountering in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and the Aegean and all of that. And then that sea, whatever this cosmic principle of sea is, it itself is divided into two things. Earth, and he says it by half, actually. So he uses the word hemi there. Earth, gay, right? Which doesn't just mean dirt, but really all the solid things like stone and all that we're encountering. And then this word that's hard to translate, prester, right? Which could mean, like here it's translated as lightning, but it's often translated as the thunderbolt, which is also similar. Some translations of it have it being a water spout or water cyclone tied together with lightning. So we don't really know what he had in mind, other than the fact that there's this process where fire is becoming sea, which is becoming earth, and this other thing. And he goes on and he says, sea drains off and is measured into the same principle as before it became earth. So again, we see that we have a kind of measuring process going on here. It's not just stupid or, brute, we could say. There's a structure to what's happening. Even more tantalizing are the passages where he talks about one thing, the life of one thing being the death of another thing. And this is where sometimes the translations get a little wonky. If we look at the actual deals, fragments that are gathered together about this, the ones that involve fire, there's several of them, and it's not always exactly the same ordering, but the basic idea is that one thing is the death of another. So, let's take a look at one of these in translation, just to give you an idea of what's going on here. Here he's talking about souls. Death for souls is the birth of water. Death for water is the birth of earth. Earth is the source of water. Water is the source of soul. This is coming from Clement, so we're not quite sure how much we could trust this, although Clement's pretty reliable. And here we're talking about death, thanatos, and birth, genesis, right? But in other cases, it's zain, life, right? The life of fire, for example, is the death of air, or the life of earth is the death of water. And so there's, again, if we go back to this, things are being exchanged for each other or put in place of each other. Now it seems like fire has a less privileged position. And maybe we actually, although there's nothing in the text to say that this is the case, but maybe speculatively, we need to say that fire has an unusual position in that it's not just fire, the element, but also, fire in the sense of this cosmic structuring thing. Again, we can't push that very far without going, beyond the text itself. Another place, he talks about the qualities, and that is worth looking at. So what do we mean by the qualities? The things that the ancient Greeks saw this four-element theory as being connected with. Here's the passage. Cool things become warm. Warm things cool down. Moist things dry out. Parched things become damp. And so we have a cosmic process of going back and forth from these four basic qualities. Warmth and coolness on the one side. Wetness and dryness on the other side. Well, it turns out that these are actually in ancient Greek cosmogony, and people other than Heraclitus, tied in with earth, air, fire, water, right? So I think we can probably read in there that Heraclitus thought more or less the same, and he's not reducing everything to these properties, but they certainly are things that are constantly changing, right? The last thing that I think is particularly important, and this is in passage 66, right? He talks about fire as approaching at Balthon. Literally means you're sort of like walking up on. And so fire itself is coming closer to other things. He uses the word panta there, actually everything. And then it does two things. By virtue of being close, it judges, krine. That's a really easy term to translate, right? It's the word that we get critic from. Judging means to like render a judgment on, good or bad, what kind of thing it is, krine. Sometimes it means to distinguish things apart from each other. And then he says something right after that. And it grasps everything. Now the term there is katalepes etai, right? Which in Greek, it's coming from katalambano. Kata is downward, but it can also be an intensifying word. Lambano is to grasp. I'm grasping my arm right now. I'm gripping it, right? And it gets used very early on for a number of things that are not physical, but are more cognitive or more adversarial. You can grasp something by like occupying it, right? You can take it, but you can also wrap your mind around it. So fire, in this case, is doing some things that, we typically would associate with human beings, or if we're ancient Greeks, with gods, because gods are also rational beings, just higher than us. Fire itself is able to judge and to mentally grasp, mentally wrap it's the tongues of fire around whatever this is supposed to be. And here we reach sort of the limits of our understanding of Heraclitus. How does fire do that? He doesn't explain. He simply asserts that it does. But I think that we should see that in terms of this everlasting fire that is flaring out and dying out in measures. And the fire that's a medium of everything. That fire appears to be itself conscious in a way that perhaps transcends us or includes our consciousness within it. And this is why, quite often, although Heraclitus doesn't say the fire is the logos, it's very tempting for us to say that in interpreting him, what he means by fire and what he means by logos are indeed the same basic thing. But here we're looking at how fire is involved as an element among the elements, but also structuring and guiding them in terms of these cosmic processes.